This is the Mobile Home Park Lawyer Podcast with Ferd Neiman. If you're looking to generate wealth and passive income in the lucrative world of mobile home parks, you're in the right place. You'll discover solutions to the common legal and operational pitfalls and how to optimize parks to maximize income. Your host is in the trenches. He's a real estate attorney, financial analyst, and mobile home park investor and operator. Now, let's turn it over to Ferd Neiman.
Welcome back, Mobile Home Park Nation. Ferd Neiman here again today with another episode of the Mobile Home Park Lawyer Podcast. Got another great guest for you. This guy is a true expert. Lots of years in the industry. I've been a follower of his on social media and just always listened to his nuggets and all his data and research. So really excited to have him on here as a guest. Please help me welcome my guest, John Neet. John, thanks for coming on, man.
I appreciate it. Appreciate you asking me.
Yeah, you bet. Well, I think we have similar views on a lot of hot topic issues. So I'm eager to hear, maybe debate them or at least pat each other on the back for our wisdom. But maybe before we get too far into it, tell us a little bit more of your background for some of the audience that doesn't know you and how you got in the space.
Well, I've been a real estate appraiser since the late 1970s, and I started doing mobile home parks seriously in the early 1990s, and kind of turned that into my exclusive practice in the mid 1990s. And since that time, I really haven't done an appraisal on any other property type other than mobile home parks and RV parks. And my practice pretty much is focused on the Western United States, west of the Rockies. I really don't go east of the Rockies. And one of the reasons for that is that there's a lot of understanding and a lot of complexities to the market on the West Coast with all the regulations that are inherent out here that we don't necessarily see in the Midwest or the South. And so it takes a little bit more of a focus on the regulatory side, and also the complexity of the mobile home parks is different out here than it is in other parts of the country. And also, we do a lot of I do a lot of work with estates and do fractional interest valuations. And I've also been heavily involved for the last 25 years in the providing expert services in the rent control area, which is becoming a much more controversial area nationwide.
Yeah, let's talk about rent control more. I just wrote a relatively small but short article for one of the magazines on the pros and cons of rent controls and some of the history. But I know I've not had to live with it like you guys do in California. In Kansas City, where I'm at, there's actually city specific rent control and there's now even a tenant rights union that's not even paying rent on two big apartment complexes in town because they've taken it from rent control to beyond, like now we have tenant strikes for not paying rent. But tell us, I know in California it's extremely complicated because it's at a city by city level and different types and stabilization and different types of rent control. Maybe give us some of the nuances of that and then how that impacts the value.
Well, when you look at, in California, there's about 115 cities and counties with their own rent control ordinance. So every one of them is different, but they also share a lot of the same characteristics. Generally, they limit your annual increases to the annual CPI or a portion thereof. Some of the more recent ones will only allow rent increases equal to 50% of the CPI change over that period of time. So you're not even keeping up with inflation. Wow. They also regulate what happens when a tenancy changes hands. So in many of these ordinances, when one tenant sells their home to an incoming tenant, that incoming tenant gets to assume the rent from the previous tenant. Sometimes there's a 10% bump, and in a few ordinances, you're allowed to go to market. If the space actually becomes vacant, then in most of the cities, you are allowed to go to market on that space. So that's how they regulate the annual increases. But where it really gets hairy is what is known as a discretionary rent increase application. And what happens there is that for one reason or another, you believe that the ordinance has not treated you fairly, and you need to have an additional rent increase, and then a process is created. Sometimes it's before a city board. More often than not, it's before an arbitrator who happens to be on a list of approved rent control arbitrators for the government agency that regulates the rent controls in that community.
Wow. Yeah, it's a different animal. I was at an MHI conference a couple years ago, and they're in West Coast, and we toured a park with one of the big operators out there, and he's like, "Yeah, we're buying that house right there, and we're getting rid of it. We're tearing it down." And I said, "Where do you buy a house like that?" It was an older home, 78 or something like that. And he said, "We're paying 20,000 for that." I said, "You're paying 20,000 for that? What are you gonna do with it?" He said, "We give it to some guy. He takes him to Mexico and sells them for scrap." And I was like, "Why are you paying 20,000?" He said, "Because the rent's $400. But if I put a new home in there, the rent's 1,200." And I was just like, "What?" He's like, "If you get rid of the home, because what essentially has happened, and you know this better than me, but what's happened is they're basically taking the upside in market rents and they're just giving it to giving it to the tenant. So if the tenant has this old, crappy home, but they can sell it to you and you can lock in artificially low rent, the home's only worth 2,000, but you might pay 30,000 for the $2,000 home because it comes with this cherry on top of reduced rent. And in the meantime, the spread of that lot rent value for the landowner has never gone to the landowner. It's being passed from one tenant to the next. So this landowner took the approach of overpaying for every home in order to vacate the lot, or they would take somebody's, "Hey, you're in a 1980 home that's 2 bed, 1 bath. Why don't you come buy this 4 bedroom house and we'll just roll it in, we'll roll in your payment for the house and the lot rent, new market lot rent, and we'll subsidize the home." And it was just this, whole nother layer of business and economics that we don't have to deal with in the Midwest because of the rent control stuff.
You have to be very creative, and the laws as they are written create a number of really perverse incentives. I often tell people that what you really need to do is go back to the 1960s and listen to White Rabbit by the Jefferson Airplane, and listen to it enough times that it makes sense to you, and it might help you to take some hallucinogenics while you're at it. And once you understand and can accept that song and the story that it tells, then you're probably ready to start working on rent control because it's just that strange. The extreme examples are all over the place. I mean, if you go to Santa Barbara, a beautiful city on the ocean, where the average house is probably about $2.5 million. You can buy it. You can buy a mobile home there for $900,000. That's pre-HUD, but you're locked into a rent that might be about $350 or $400 a month, and which is probably $200 cheaper than, say, Bakersfield. So it's not really, I don't want to demean Bakersfield in any way, but it's not Santa Barbara. And if you are paying lower rent in Santa Barbara than you would be in Bakersfield, there's something wrong with the system. And so the owners do have to look into all of that. One of the things that we've seen over time is there's been less and less naivete on the part of incoming owners. We'll hear from people every now and again, and they'll say something like, "I would never buy a park in California just because of that." Soon that story is going to add more and more states to it. I mean, certainly, we're seeing that happen in Maine right now. We're seeing it happen. Delaware has a statewide rent control, so does Oregon, but it's going to expand over time. One of the things that people come in and they read the ordinances and they read the rules, and it sounds almost reasonable. Like I need to be able to get a fair return. But what's defined as a fair return is much different at the city level. And unfortunately, they've been able to convince the courts and the appellate courts that these things are reasonable. And so if you think that, or if you would hold that a 5% return on your investment, in terms of your annual cash flow, before we start talking about your equity cash flow, but just the park cash flow. If you think a 5% return on that is reasonable, you'll fit right in with the state and the government. That's just not it certainly doesn't work in the investment world. And unfortunately, they've been able to convince the courts that this is all cool.
So how does rent control impact valuation? Obviously, if there's there's current income that you're valuing, the NOI divided by cap rate, is that one methodology of getting income approach to value, right? But how do you factor in future NOI or lack of future NOI growth? And you just basically, do you make it a higher cap rate in your appraisal, or do you have a, as is, as stabilized, numerous, future values, or how do you factor that in? And then also just, I'm curious on the fractional piece, that's not a concept that most of us hear about or deal with on a daily basis. So how does that come into play?
Well, the way that the market tends to recognize rent control, it's becoming more and more cognizant of its impact on value than it was in the past. We used to not see a significant difference in the cap rate between parks that were under rent control and parks that were not under rent control.
Hmm.
We're seeing that gap widen now. People have become more cognizant of it, and they do look at the specific ordinances. One of the hard things, if you're trying to extract a cap rate from the market, and you look at a sale that's in one city, and that city might have a relatively benign rent control ordinance, say allows the annual CPI with a minimum of 3%. That's not, I mean, it's not great, but it's not bad. And if that's your comp for a sale of the property that you're appraising, which has a 50% of CPI limitation and a maximum increase of 4%, then that needs to be adjusted. So what we're seeing is that some of the cities that have the worst rent controls are seeing a lot lower transaction level, and where transactions occur, they do tend to be more conservative. On the, in terms of how it affects fractional interest, and most people tend to not really think about fractional interest until they start talking to their trust attorney and their accountant and start working out, trust donations and estate tax payments and all of that sort of thing. But there's a number of things that when you look at a mobile home park, there's a number of issues that could lead to a higher discount, because if you're looking at a property that has rent control, or if you're looking at a property that has natural upsides, you don't want to compare the fractional interest value of that particular property to a widget manufacturer, or a retail mall, or an apartment building, because the characteristics are different. One of the things that we're seeing more and more people concentrate on in the partial interest segment is the use of an internal rate of return analysis on the income to the individual share. So combined with a required internal rate of return, which has to be higher than for the whole property because of the lack of control and the lack of marketability. And you look at that, but you can also look at that and say, this particular shareholder is not going to get the kind of return that might be anticipated in another property type, and so there is a higher discount awarded. Kind of the days of going to partnership profiles and pulling a 30% number out of your hat is those days are kind of gone, and there's a lot of the partial interest valuation, fractional interest valuation today requires a very, very sophisticated analysis and support for your conclusions.
Yeah, makes sense for sure. And I'm curious, you're talking about impact of rent control on cap rates. What's your view, and what are you seeing in the last, 3, 6, 12 months, interest rates, how interest rates have impacted cap rates? I know there was a big hurrah, in the last 60 days. Okay, great. Rates at the Fed are down 50 bips, but has that impacted appraisals yet? Has it impacted interest rates to the average commercial borrower? I was curious your insights on that.
We're starting to see people get more active. What's been interesting is that I don't know how this trend goes nationally, but at least in the Western United States, what we've seen in the last 2.5, 3 years is that the market has shifted from looking at stabilized investment grade properties. I mean, those are still popular with the upper end of the spectrum, the REITs and those folks. So we're seeing those folks still investing in the stabilized properties. But what we are seeing more and more of the mid-tier investors looking at is, where do I get upside? And that has become the major driver rather than a stabilized level of return. Is just where does the upside come in this? Are the rents below market? Is there some vacancy issues? Can I expand the park? And because of that, it's difficult to compare the cap rates across the board. On the institutional grade properties, we're seeing the cap rates we're seeing cap rates in the the high fours and low fives out here. So that's probably 150 basis points over the absolute peak of the market several years ago. It's still and then when you look into the other properties, it's difficult to draw a cap rate off of those because of the other influences that get in there, like the search for upside. So it might appear to be aggressive, um, but it maybe not necessarily so once you dig into the transaction. I can think of a transaction not too long ago, but it was an older trailer park that was 50% older single wides and 50% RVs. It was in a rent controlled jurisdiction. And for some reason, the seller was not cognizant of some of the details of that rent control ordinance, which allowed for market rent to be imposed upon vacancy, on space vacancy, which if you're renting to RVs, those spaces become vacant. So, the property reflected a tremendous amount of upside because on the half of the spaces that were subject to RV, you could take those from around the mid sixes in rent to around $1,400 a month in rent.
Wow.
Because it was that high end of a rental market, and the demand was so high. Whereas, so when you look at that, it's tough to say, well, it's sold for a trailer park sold for a mid four cap rate. Okay, but you have to recognize that
Right.
this other
No, I mean, I always
is in
think
there.
say the same thing. I mean, cap rate's important, but it's not as important on a deal that's got value at. I mean, the best deal I've ever owned, and people are like, what was the cap rate when you bought it? And I said, well, I guess it was well, it was below one. It was zero. The NOI was negative. I mean, what is how do you
Sure.
get a cap rate, right? I mean, I bought it on negative NOI. The first 6 banks told me no because like, how are you going to buy a park and that's got negative NOI? I said, because I'm not going to run it the same way as that guy. I'm not going to have 11 personnel when it needs 1.5. I'm not going to have low occupancy, things like that. So it was mostly vacant, but it was in a good market with good infrastructure. I just need to bring the occupancy up. Well, then the cap rate went through the roof once I had it fixed. So it's just one variable. I'm curious. One thing I'm curious, and this is a simple question with I'm sure with a complicated answer, but how do you value a vacant pad? 6-8 years ago, I went to Frank Rolf's boot camp like a lot of guys, and Frank was always big on don't pay for vacant site. Vacant sites have no value. In fact, they have negative value because you got to mow the grass and push the snow in front of them. But then 2020, 2021, 22. I couldn't figure out how I couldn't win a bid. Well, the part of the reason I couldn't win a bid to buy anything was because I was valuing all the vacant lots at zero, and some guys are valuing them at 50%, 60% of an occupied lot. Now, that may have been too aggressive. I think I've seen him, especially in tertiary markets, that seems to that appetite has come down some. But I'm curious what you all, how do you value those? And does the market matter? Does the size of the lot, the infrastructure, or, how granular of analysis do you get into your appraisals, or do you see your clients or your lender's clients, the buyers, valuing those?
What we really try to do is talk to people and find out what people are thinking in terms of the market, and it varies all over the board. But let's assume for a second that these are empty spaces that have the infrastructure in place, and basically you've got to do a little lot prep, and you can move a home in. When you look at those, you're right. Historically, the market has said this is horrible. I'm not paying a nickel for that space. It's not generating income, and I have to mow it. Snow removal is not a real issue out here. Uh,
Fair
but
enough.
but what we see now is that with the advent of a number of different ways to make those lots generate income, we see people becoming more and more aggressive on what they're willing to pay. So if you're in a market or you were in a jurisdiction that would allow you to place RVs on those lots as a short-term solution, then you may be willing to pay, 50, 60% of retail for those spaces because you can fill them instantly. In California, for example, if the park was built before 1992, and don't take my word for that, it's more complicated, believe me. But generally, if it's an older park, you have no problem placing RVs on those sites. Now, your cost of acquisition for an RV tenant is, $10.
Yeah.
A sign, a notice in Craigslist, whatever it might be. Whereas the cost of acquisition of a tenant, if you're going to place a new manufactured home or even a used manufactured home on that site, can be substantial. So that's changed a lot of the thinking. And if you're in a position that you can do that, then those sites can become more valuable if there is demand. We obviously one of the things we're seeing out here is that many people are using different means to convert older high density mobile home parks into extended stay RV parks. That's become quite a significant trend just because they tend to escape rent controls as long as you follow the rules, because believe me, there are rules.
All right. I know we've done a ton of zoning research. We haven't done anything really in California, but we've probably done stuff in 30 states and all over 150 cities at this point, to kind of combat cities a lot. But what's interesting on the RVs is some cities say we only want tourists, so the RVs are allowed, but they must pick up and move every 30 days or less because we want lots of traffic and transient guests. They want me and my family coming in for 10 days, spend a bunch of money at the restaurants and bars, and then getting out of town and repeat. Others are the opposite. Some other cities say, we don't want the drifter coming through town for the sheet metal job on the third shift. We want permanent people that are calling these RV spaces home. These are typically RV spaces in mobile home parks or just mobile home park spaces where people that are too small for MH that people will want, my clients will want an RV in. And some of these cities will say, we'll allow you to have an RV, but you have to sign a minimum lease of 6 months because
And
we
that
want them to
varies.
stay.
That varies too. And in some places it's enforced, some places it's not enforced. We've done when we do an appraisal, we pretend that the law is real, or assume that the law is real and that it is going to be enforced. So there's certain areas we run into cities where uh, they act as if there is no restriction, but there is a restriction in place that if enforced would be a problem. So we have to reflect that in the appraisal. But yeah, it's one of those things of you have to take it on a case by case basis, and that's always the difficulty. When you're doing an appraisal, or you're valuing the property for the purposes of submitting a purchase offer, is being able to get into that investigation and know what the answer is going to be. And that's also being reflected in other areas of your expenses. Some cities now have passed a living wage ordinance that requires all of the employees to be paid something more than the minimum wage. That may increase your maintenance costs. That may increase your cost of your on-site management costs. When you're looking at, obviously the cost of insurance is a crazy topic for everybody these days, but nonetheless it's important. And the same thing is with taxes. What is the potential for taxes? I see lots of pro formas coming through where there's no set state law. Some states, California, Oregon, Nevada, you know exactly what's going to happen to the taxes after the sale. Now, the same thing doesn't happen in all three of those states, but you know what's going to happen. In other states, they have the rule that, well, the assessor will take into consideration what the property sold for. And in some states, they take that with a vengeance. So we see a lot of pro formas being put out in, say, for example, in the state of Washington, that just forecast the taxes to continue. And we look at this, and the way that we look at it is we go back 2 or 3 years, find some sales of mobile home parks. They're not there. We'll look at sales of apartments, look at a sales price, and look at how it changed the taxes in that particular county. And I think that's something that if you're looking to purchase a mobile home park, or any kind of real estate, and you want an idea of what's going to happen to the taxes after the purchase, that's probably the best way to look at it, because you're not going to get anything more than word salad from the assessor if you call them and ask them what's going to happen.
No, that's a good point. You may not know this. I used to be the county appraiser here in Kansas City in Jackson County. And I left and I went to a private law firm, and we had a client that was buying one of the more premier shopping districts in Kansas City. And the purchase price was $660 million and was on the tax rolls for 125. And nobody thought it was worth 660. And unfortunately, it just went into foreclosure, and it's resold at 300 or something. But they asked me, what do you think the tax was going to go to, from 125 to 660? And I said, based on all historical generations and of appraisers and county assessors and cycles and sales of all other properties and comps, it's hard to find comps for a property of that magnitude. I said, I don't think it's going to go up more than 12.5%. I said, however, good thing I put this in there. If there's a change in political leadership, all bets are off, and it'll depend on their view on this. And it changed in political leadership, and to a non-politician for like the first time in a while, former Hall of Fame baseball player, for the Kansas City Royals, became county executive, changed the assessor, and what do you know? The price went from 125 all the way up to $660 million. So it was the difference was over $5 million in taxes, and they bought it at a 3 point something cap rate. Like, what is your value? How much you just get kicked in the teeth? Over $100 million in value because your NOI hit. So it's super important to underwrite those taxes. And yeah, some counties will tell you how to do it. Some statutes will show you exactly how it's going to happen, and a lot of them are going to be the discretion of the appraiser. And in the smaller markets, the appraisal staff doesn't often have much staff or much computer systems or sophistication, so it's even more of a good old boys Wild West. So it's definitely important to underwrite that. But I see people. We've gotten lucky. I've had it where I've gotten lucky. I've had it where I've gotten burned. I've had it happen where it's right where I thought it was, and it's like, I'm pretty knowledgeable on this stuff, but it's a little bit of a roll of the dice.
Well, we see, I mean, even the lenders struggle with it. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, unless you have some evidence to support a different theory, they generally want to see in their appraisals 75% of the purchase price as the new assessment. Obviously, in California, you're going to go 100% of the purchase price.
Right.
And, in Nevada, you'd go by what the statutory rules are, and the same thing in Oregon. And you're varying that from state to state to state. But we know, when you look in Arizona, for example, there's properties that sold. I probably shouldn't say this in case someone's listening, but there's properties that sold for $5 million 10 years ago that are still on the books for $2 million. So it is a variable, and because it's a significant variable, it's something that the potential buyer needs to look at very, very clearly. And that's why, when it gets very, very complex, and that's one of the things that we run into doing appraisals. And I guess because of the way that I've always approached this, is that we take a look at that second, that second or third reasoning. How do we get to something that's reasonable on that? That example that I just gave you, we were talking about the upside potential from the release of the RV spaces. We did not do an appraisal on that property, but the appraiser who didn't pick that up. And so, the lender that made the loan on that property was completely unaware of the upside potential that that existed within the property.
Interesting. And I'm curious in your experience in particular the last year or two of who's the buyer nowadays. I mean, I've got a lot of clients on the law firm side that first time buyers, been in the apartment business, been in some other business. So I'm seeing more and more apartment guys coming into MH, and maybe those are just the ones that are looking for new legal counsel or what they perceive to be niche legal counsel. So they're new to me, but so it feels like I'm getting a lot of apartment guys. Are you seeing more and more apartment buyers? And then, I'm related, I'm curious your views on, consolidation. If you'd asked me 5 years ago when the market was being consolidated, I probably would have said in the next 5 years. I would have been wrong because it hasn't happened yet. So I'm curious your views on who the new buyers are, and then how that impacts, the future ownership.
Well, I think that most of the buyers that we're seeing are people we already know. We're not seeing a lot of new skin in the game. We're seeing, occasionally you'll see a few deals here and there that are purchased by somebody you've never heard of. But especially out here on the West Coast, the main players that run in this market and have been for the last 10 years are the main people we see buying. One of the things that I thought was interesting over the last few years is that we've seen a lot of the California-based buyers. I know because when I called to confirm the sales, I'm using a 714 area code for in Orange County. They're all in Newport Beach, by the way. And so but you're seeing they're more and more expanding across the country. And they'd started going to markets that they felt familiar with because of the similar urban nature, like Florida. But now they're extending into the Carolinas and into Tennessee and other places that they really had not gone before. And one of the things that we hear from them is that, well, we kind of like that because we don't have the level of regulation that we have with our parks in California. And so it encourages us because we can get a better return on that. And then because of their experience in operating parks in this highly regulated environment out here on the West Coast, they're much more cognizant of ways to keep their costs down to a reasonable level, and to make sure that they're maximizing their efficiency of management. We're still seeing, that when it comes to the investment grade properties, it's all the same people that are, 1 through 5 on the list of the top mobile home park owners in the country. And then in the mid tier, it's the people that we've been seeing doing that for the last 10 years. So I don't see a lot of new people coming in. But there are a few transactions here and there.
Okay. Now, what's your view of the future for your second and third tier parks? I mean, tertiary markets. Maybe the 30 site parks, the park owned homes, the private utilities, compared to your institutional grade stuff. Do you think that stuff is going to continue to do well, or do you think that there's going to be more of a transition to the top tier properties and less investment in the lower tiers?
Well, I think that because, in the states that I work in, because of the regulatory environment, I know one attorney I used to work for once said that the only business that's not allowed to go out of business is a mobile home park business. And that's certainly, the cost of closing a park and everything is becoming more and more of an issue. So we're seeing less and less parks being converted to other uses. So when you look at the older parks, they're often, if they're located in a market where they happen to fall into a niche that allows them to continue to be good performers, I think they're going to continue on indefinitely. I mean, we talk about aging infrastructure, but in many cases, the infrastructure that's out there in the street in front of the park is older than the infrastructure that's in the park. And so it's not necessarily that stuff is becoming obsolete. One of the nice things in California, believe it or not, is we have a program out here that's administered by the Public Utilities Commission that allows the utilities to be taken from being sub-metered, the gas and electricity anyway, from taking to be sub-metered by the park owner and turning those over to the providing utility. And the providing utility comes in and replaces all the infrastructure at no cost. So,
Nice.
basically, basically it's called utility replacement plan. And the only reason it's was approved or sold was as a benefit to the residents and tenants, to be able to not have blackouts and stuff. It wasn't sold as a benefit to the owners, but it certainly is a benefit to the owners to get
Oh,
out of the
sure.
utility business.
No, I've had a couple clients
In
do
other
that.
parts, in many parts of the country, the gas and electric utilities are typically directly metered anyway. But in California, they have always been sub-metered, has been the more commonly.
Yeah, sub-metered is pretty rare in the Midwest for gas and electric. I mean, so we see that once in a while, but not that much. But I've seen people do it with private utilities on the water and sewer, where I've had a couple clients that have done it. There's a similar. It's not really a government program, but it's kind of say quasi-government, where the Public Service Commission has approved certain entities like cost plus business model, and they want your park to have failing infrastructure. Like, great, we'll buy it up. That way we can put in $1 million upgrade, and we get to charge $1 million plus 7% for the next 30 years. You know, and they're like, but we want to tackle it. Now they're not available in every location is the challenge. Otherwise, I'd give them, I'd go out and go buy a bunch of these parks that have failing infrastructure specifically to have these guys upgraded. But it's a unique thing.
Well, I think that, and again, that points out to the local nature of the real estate investment. I mean, there's a tendency, because mobile home parks are not as common as many other investment properties, say apartments, for example. There's, in any given market, there's hundreds or thousands of apartment buildings that someone can pick from. And if you want to invest in apartments in a metropolitan area, you probably don't even have to leave town to go see them all. With mobile home parks, because there's fewer of them and because there's fewer of them being traded, we see that people tend to go across a wider geographic area. And unless they understand the little local nuances, then that's something that, that could be, could cause harm to the investment going down the road. We recently, California, once again, recently passed a law that limits the amount that you can charge for water. Basically, you can charge cost plus about $4.75 per space per month to each tenant for their water. So before we had a rule that was more or less whatever the local utility is charging homeowners, that's what, if you don't go past that amount, you'll be fine. But that's no longer the case. They've changed that law. I think that we will continue to see further restrictions and further complications on the ownership model, which means that people that are coming into this industry really need to sit down and understand what's going on, not only globally, or the view from 30,000 feet, as I call it, of the industry, but also what's going on in the local market with the local government, the local utilities, and all of that sort of thing, to make sure that you're not making an assumption based upon the view from 30,000 feet that that will come to hurt you down the road if you didn't really stop and take a good look under the hood before you bought.
Yeah, of course. Now, do you think that the regulatory environment from the West Coast is going to make its way east?
I think it will. I think it will. I think there's, I tend not to try to want to get into discussing politics on these sorts of things. But what I will say is that both political parties have taken a more populist bent and are looking at things from a different lens than they used to. I know that, last year, I believe there was an attempt to pass a state law that would allow local option rent controls for mobile home parks in Iowa. Now, I
Right.
think that Iowa's that's pretty red state. So I don't think that, I don't think that the political uh, mood of the state, and as you mentioned in Kansas City, We have tenant unions being formed. We're starting to hear about tenant unions. There's you're leading us actually on this one. In Berkeley, there is an initiative on the ballot next week that will allow tenants to form unions in the city of Berkeley. And we're also seeing more and more grassroots efforts. So we're seeing local rent control ordinances going into effect in Maine, in other states where it's allowed by the state legislature. I think that, if you're taking the difference between the devil and the deep blue sea sort of approach, you'd probably rather have it at the state level than at the local level. Because the rent controls at the state level, Oregon's rent control law, which applies to both apartments and mobile home parks, is relatively benign. And I think you'd have to get annual increases. I think the annual increase is around 9% this year that you can go up to. So you have a little bit of room to move there. Whereas when you start getting the local initiatives, then you get back into the hold my beer contest between the city as to who can pass the most onerous ordinance.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I mean, in Kansas City, we've seen it with this, with some of the, rent controls. Or Kansas City didn't have a rent control per se, but they passed an ordinance on no discrimination of income, which means if my income's from my law firm, okay, if I make $100, I make $100. If my income is from Section 8, it's the same $100. So basically, you must accept Section 8 law. And now these tenant rights groups, and then there's a lot of new permit conditions for if you want to build new houses, you got to do X, Y, and Z. So what we've seen is permits in the city proper have gone way down in investment, and all these suburban areas are getting all the money and all the investment because people are voting with their feet, if you will, and like, I'm going to invest elsewhere. So it's really just, I think it's going to be a failed experiment. But that's what blows me away on rent control is, it's been around for a long time in a lot of places, and it hasn't really done that well. But it's growing, even though it's failed in a lot of instances.
Well, it's not a solution that actually reduces the cost of housing for anybody. What it does, obviously, is it gives the tenants in place when the rent control ordinance passes a benefit. And in the case of mobile home parks, because if they have vacancy or transfer controls, then the tenant is allowed to pass on the present value of that rent advantage to the successor tenant and get a higher price for their home. I mean, we see that all over the place. It's interesting. There's an interesting kind of parallel in one city in Northern California where there was one park owner who purchased a park many years ago that was horribly abused. And because the rent control ordinance allowed you to charge market rent on vacant spaces, this owner took and removed all these old junk single wides and was able to bring people in on new homes and sign long-term leases that were more beneficial to him, to the owner, than the rent control was. And so you have several mobile home parks in this city that are relatively similar. And you go to one of them and homes are selling for $150,000 and the space rent's $1,400. And then you go to the next one and the rents are $600 and the homes are selling for $300,000. And it's just a mixed up bag that doesn't really promote the affordability of housing, because as long as you're allowing that benefit to be passed through to a successor tenant in the mobile home park world, then the departing tenant is going to be able to monetize that. And so when you look at all these different influences, to me, the problem isn't that rent control doesn't solve the problem. The problem is it's the only solution that is being presented to the folks at the city level. And when we talk about property rights, which is an important argument, I mean, you're an attorney, it's an important argument to discuss property rights and, you know, how that has led to the success of the United States. But when you talk about property rights, you know, it kind of pales in the terms of immediacy to the person who is being evicted because they can't afford to pay the rent, or the person who can't afford to find a home for their family because of where the rents are now. And it's it's not that rent control provides a solution that's workable in the long term, but it provides something that can be called a solution by the people who end up can say, look, we're doing something about it, you know. And whereas we as an industry, you know, continue to talk about property rights. I know that, you know, that's becoming one of the big issues on the right of first refusal laws in terms of the property rights, that people are, you know, the industry is upset because that's transferring a valuable right to the tenants. You know, on the other hand, you know, the reason that is happening, you know, say in Colorado is one of the worst. The reason why that sort of thing is occurring is because there's been no mechanism created that would allow the tenants in a mobile home park to compete with investors in terms of purchasing the mobile home park if it comes up for sale. I mean, if you're an investor, you're, you know, immediately prepared to make an offer on a property that's listed for sale. If you're living in that property, you know, this is probably the furthest thing from your imagination. There's no mechanism that can allow you to do that. I mean, I think most people believe that allowing the tenants in a mobile home park to purchase that mobile home park is ultimately a good thing for those tenants. They get to control their destiny. They become homeowners. There's all kinds of good benefits that flow from that. The problem is that now we're going to try and turn it into a coercive event and require that that the seller, you know, meet all these deadlines and do certain things to ensure that they have that ability. And we'll make that, instead of making it an ability, we'll make it a right. And that's where it kind of goes off the rails. So, you know, when you're looking at the, you know, from the investor's standpoint, you know, why do I want to come in and expend, you know, $50,000 or $100,000 in due diligence costs when I know that if the tenants jump up 90 days from now and say, we're here, that all of those costs go to naught because the tenants have the right of first refusal. So it's a question, you know, again, it's a question of balancing the various aspects. And that's what's becoming more, you know, that's what's becoming more and more difficult to do. We see a fair amount of nonprofit purchases out here in the West, 501c3s purchasing mobile home parks. But the obvious benefit that they have is that they can, you know, there's a joint powers authority in California that allows them to float municipal revenue bonds, and they can react instantly. They are, you know, people that are running those things are people that have been in the mobile home park business before, so they have that opportunity.
It's a unique animal, that's for sure. I've seen it happen to some of my clients where they're getting ready to buy it, and then the tenants step up and buy it, and they're like, I'm out. We've been able to fortunately get some contract provisions to say they get reimbursed, but that doesn't say they don't get paid for their time. They get reimbursed for like our fees and things like that. But it's like they wouldn't have started to break even, right? They put all this effort into it, and then the tenants bought it and they get their money back at best. Yeah, I've seen people purposely violate the ROFR provisions, just because there's no teeth in it. Some of them were, you know, like, hey, the other guy gets penalized, we're not going to tip him off, kind of thing. But they just, you know, public policy is an interesting animal. And on that topic, you know, I feel like it would be, if the government has a public policy where they want the tenants to buy the parks, they should do something like, say, if I sell my park to the tenants, I don't have income taxes, no capital gain. And I mean, then I would, you know, if I was going to sell my park for $1 million, but the tenants would offer $999, but I don't have to pay taxes, I might sell to the tenants for $999. I might be motivated to go to the tenants. I don't have to be coerced to it. There's some, you know, there's the carrot and the stick, and our government tends to always give us the carrot, it seemed, or excuse me, give us the stick of you're gonna get hit with it.
I agree with you completely on that. I think we have moved from a point of having a balance between carrots and sticks to really being, sticks, whips, chains, whatever it might be to encourage us. Waterboarding will be the next step, I'm sure. But that's it. I mean, it's interesting because if you were to sell your mobile home park to a nonprofit, don't quote me on this, talk to your tax advisor before you believe what I'm saying, but you have a longer period to nominate an exchange property if you sell it to a nonprofit. I don't believe that exists if you sell it to a mutual benefit corporation. So the government could provide a benefit there that they're already providing, just extending it to the residents or the tenants if they were the purchasing party, and that would be a benefit to the owner. So that there are things that can be done to encourage this without getting into the gun to the head routine. But unfortunately, because it not only do we have divided government, but we have divided government that really doesn't want to listen to the other side in anything. I mean, recently we had one city here in California, national city down in San Diego County. They passed a rent control ordinance, and they didn't bother to notify any of the owners of rent control parks in the city that an ordinance was being discussed, prepared, or anything else. It was let's sneak it through. And the owners did manage to come back and say, well, wait a minute, that's not fair. We have to have some public hearings. And
Yeah, you have to hear it. Normally, it's some sort of right to be heard.
well, they kind of got that message across, and so now there's some reconsideration of it going on. But that's the sort of thing that we see. We see happening is that everybody is looking at this from an adversarial viewpoint, not a cooperative viewpoint. We're not saying, how do we work together to solve this problem of affordable housing? We're saying, well, no, it's on your plate, you're going to fix it, and this is how you're going to do it, whether that works or not. And in most cases, it doesn't work.
Well, John, lots of good stuff, lots of nuggets. Appreciate your wisdom. Any before we jump, any other last minute nuggets, or if not, also how can people find you after this?
Well, I think that if you've got any questions about anything I've talked about, feel free to call me or email me. My email address is pretty simple. It's jneet@johnneet.com. I am on LinkedIn, so you can follow me. Just look up my name, John Neet. And I'm one of those people that actually gives out his cell phone number, although that may be a mistake here. But if you want to call me, give me a ring at 951-852-1754. I certainly appreciate having you talk to me today, Ferd. It's been a great conversation, and look forward to future benefits for both of us.
Yeah, likewise, John. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks.
You got it.
You've been listening to the Mobile Home Park Lawyer Podcast with Ferd Neiman. Ready to learn more? Go to www.themobilehomelawyer.com for free resources and materials to help you succeed. If you love the podcast, go to Apple Podcasts, give us your review, and subscribe today. Thank you for listening. Neither the Supreme Court of Missouri nor the Missouri Bar reviews nor approves certifying organizations or specialist designations. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely upon advertisements.